What's the crack? My name is Blindboy Boatclub. I'm a writer and an artist, and I'm here as part of the Court International Festival of Literature, and I'm chatting to the academic and author Emma Dabiri. Her book Don't Touch My Hair came out in 2018, and now she has a new book called What White People Can Do Next, From Allyship to Coalition. Emma, what's the crack?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. Yeah, grand. Book came out yesterday, so all pretty hectic. But
I
yeah,
can imagine so.
a good response to the book overall. And I think a lot of people is surprised by the contents because the book is it's not necessarily what it does on the tin. It's kind of a subversion of what a lot of people think it is.
Yes, because we chatted previously and we spoke about how the title of the book is consciously provocative.
Mm-hmm.
And I like and to the when I had you on my podcast, and when I announced that you were going to be on my podcast and I named the title of the book, I got a few kind of passive aggressive messages from people who felt kind of offended by the title of it. What can white people do next? They were like, what do you mean? Is this a book that's telling me what to do? And they were really reactionary and stuff. But the content of the book is you talk about the structure of racism. Can you talk about racism as a structure and its historical roots?
Yeah, totally. So just to go a little bit back to the title, like what that does is actually kind of use the language of the current liberal understanding of race
Yes.
and racism and the kind of mainstream anti-racist movement, kind of use the language and formulation of that to actually deconstruct like a lot of the premises of the
Mm-hmm.
contemporary mainstream anti-racism that we're seeing. To me, that movement is, and its propositions and its instructions are often ahistorical, lacking in context, and absent of any analysis of class or capitalism. Instead, there's this almost fetishization of interpersonal privileges. So people talk about structural racism, but then seem to focus more on interpersonal actions as
Mm-hmm.
solutions. So to me, what is key and necessary is, first of all, to understand that the category white and the
Mm-hmm.
category black are socially constructed categories that were invented with a very specific, and they're invented often. When I say that blackness and whiteness are invented, people are like, what? That's not
Yeah, a lot of
necessarily kind of.
people have trouble getting their heads around that one because like what does that mean, a social construct?
Yeah, exactly. So basically, the idea, like, so the fact that people have had different complexions, different hair
Yeah.
textures, different types of features, that has been the case for millennia. But the fact that those features have any intrinsic meaning that is translated into those are white people and
Yeah.
those are black people, and a set of characteristics and assumptions that goes with those racial categories, that is like an incredibly new way of understanding ourselves and understanding each other's. Well, when I say incredibly new, I mean incredibly new from a historical perspective. It's
Yeah.
only since 1661, but I love that we can actually trace the introduction
Yeah.
of the idea of white people and the idea of black people actually to a year and a place, colonial Barbados, and a set of slave codes that were introduced. And they were introduced following a series of uprisings that had occurred between enslaved Africans and indentured Irish labourers who fought together, who worked on the plantations of English and Scottish
Mm-hmm.
landowners, and came together to like attack them basically.
Mm-hmm.
That was really threatening to the power, to power, to the status quo, because there was more enslaved people and more indentured laborers. They were the majority. So one of the things, so as a reaction to that, we see the introduction of these slave codes that really enshrine the notion of a black race that is
Mm-hmm.
inferior to a white race that is
Mm-hmm.
superior. And it's to justify the enslavement of Africans that these economies and the economies of the West are becoming increasingly dependent on. But it's also to shut down those solidarities, those class solidarities that are emerging between indentured Irish and enslaved African, and then in Virginia, actually between indentured English and enslaved
Mm-hmm.
African, so that even like working whites whose labor is exploited and are living in like indentured servitude,
Mm-hmm.
they start to see their fate and their future more in alignment with other white people, even if those are white
Mm-hmm.
people of an exploitative elite class. So that's the history where and so it's introduced into law, and it spreads like wildfire. First of all, through laws throughout the Caribbean, what will become North America, and eventually all over the world. But it's a relatively recent construct, and I think it's key that we know that history. I don't think we can
Yeah.
really talk about race and anti-racism without understanding those processes of racialization, why they happened, and also understanding how intrinsic capitalism is to all of this. This is also in the period of history where the system of capitalism that we still live under, I mean, it's morphed and become kind of more obscene through,
Yeah.
like things like neoliberalism, but the kind of early origins of it are there in that system of plantation labor and transatlantic trade. And it's to justify that system that this racial hierarchy is also introduced. So capitalism is there at the beginning. That
Yeah.
relationship between capitalism and race is so important to understand.
So basically, the structure of racism very much serves the structure of capitalism. They work hand in hand together. Um, One other little thing too, because you were mentioning Barbados there in the 1600s, and there's kind of a pervasive and harmful myth online that I see a lot being used by people who are being racist about the Irish slaves.
Mm-hmm.
This idea that in Barbados in the 1600s, where you're speaking about, there were Irish indentured servants, there are indentured laborers, but you see people online, especially Irish Americans, and they say, well, my ancestors, the Irish, were slaves too, and you don't see them complaining, and it's this really harmful thing. Can you describe exactly what indentured servitude was and why these Irish and Scottish and English were different to chattel slaves?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so you see that to undermine kind of undermine Black people talking about the historic oppression
Hmm.
that they have experienced and the intergenerational consequences of that. And the difference is, first of all, I'll say being an indentured laborer was shit. Like, like
Hmm.
it's not like it's not a good position to have in
Yeah.
society. Not trying to undermine like how crap it is.
Hmm.
At the same time, it was usually for a period of time, often 7 years, um, after which you were free. So it's a relatively short period of time. You also have human rights enshrined in contract
Hmm.
law, whereas for chattel for people of African descent, who were slaves as opposed to indentured laborers. Actually, there are some accounts that before the introduction of these slave codes and of race, when some of the earliest Africans were being brought to these colonies, they were kidnapped, but they were actually sometimes in the first few years, things were better for them than they became after the
Yeah.
invention of race, and their position was more akin to that of an indentured servant
Hmm.
before racial lines hardened, which happened really quickly in a matter of kind of decades. But very soon they were, enslaved. And the difference with chattel slavery was that, I mean, there's actually debate about those early years of indentured servitude versus enslavement won't get into that too much. As a slave, which was what as an enslaved person, which was the experience that people of African descent had, they were owned in perpetuity. So by having a child, that your offspring will be owned in perpetuity. There is no end in sight. You also are not seen as a human being that has any rights. So it's now a situation where, like a black person, an enslaved person, couldn't give evidence, for example, against a white person, even a white person of the lower class now, an indentured servant. So they had power of life and death over people of African descent. So it was a way in which, white people that didn't have power in any other quarter of their life had power of life and death over black people. So they could do anything they wanted to you, and you had no recourse to any form of justice because you are property rather than a human being. You're a commodity. And again, that's that relationship with capitalism. You're a commodity as a black person, not as an indentured laborer.
So the first chapter in the book is about coalition, and one theme that is throughout the book, and so you take issue with the term allyship, the inherent power dynamics that exists within the phrase ally, and you argue instead for coalition. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a problem with allyship on two levels. The first of all, it kind of reinforces this dynamic that we see of, charity and the idea, as I say in the book, I've seen too much reference to the ally and the victim. I find that like deeply insulting and patronizing. It reinforces the power dynamic of missionaries, of white saviors, of the need of black people's need for the benevolent white charitable figure to help them, So I reject it, first of all, on that level, because I feel like, black people don't need charity or they don't need charity. There just needs to be kind of justice, And then the second thing is, I think it really misses a trick conceptually, in that it doesn't identify allyship, doesn't identify the ways in which many white people also experience forms of oppression and exploitation, in terms of the fact that capitalism, late stage capitalism, the system that we currently live under, is one that diminishes the lifestyle of almost everybody, and I think because there's that absence of really thinking about capitalism, we fail to pinpoint the ways in which, obviously, people who aren't being subject to racism. So I'm not saying white people experience racism, but they do experience other forms of exploitation. And just because you don't experience racism doesn't mean that you don't experience inequality, or doesn't mean that your life isn't like shit in many ways, So if we kind of reframe it to actually think about the exploitation perpetuated by capitalism, we can see that we should all be working together to try and change the system, because we all stand to benefit from it, rather than seeing it as, oh, well, black people just need help. One of the quotes that I have in the book from Fred Moten, who's a theorist and philosopher whose work I love, who's rooted in something called the Black radical tradition, is he says, I don't need your help. I just need you to know that this shit is killing you too, however much more softly. So I think that sums it up really beautifully.
That's the second last chapter in the book is recognize that this shit is killing you too. And is that... Are you trying to speak there for that's the common ground for people to identify a common ground? What I'm trying to get at too as well is you take issue with the current form of, we'll call it, online activism around race. Why is that? Why is that a problem to coalition and common understanding? The current online activism.
So when you look at the identity politics, so identity politics as a term is coined in the
Like, how
1980s.
is that phrase? Here's the thing, just that phrase, right? That's a
Mm-hmm,
phrase that I often see people on the right using. Is that like
mm-hmm.
that phrase identity politics is, if you say that online, if you were to say it on Twitter, people would very quickly denounce you. But like, what is identity politics?
Yeah. So I mean, I critique the current articulation of identity politics, but I'm
Mm,
coming from a very different perspective than a right
yeah,
wing
of
commentator.
course, of course.
Um, but when it's a term, I think it's important that we know where terms come from. I think we use
Yeah.
a lot of language and concepts, we don't actually know where they come from or what they meant in their original contexts. um, the Combahee River Collective um, are a group of women who identify as Black lesbian socialists. Audre Lorde is one of them, and they coined the phrase identity politics in the 1980s. And they
Mm-hmm.
talk about the way they're like radical activists and thinkers, and they talk about the way they kind of, there wasn't a place for them in the mainstream feminist movement,
Yeah.
because of their race, but then also like the sexism that they've experienced in the Black liberation movements of the
Mm-hmm.
70s. And so they're like carving out a space that kind of recognizes the intersections of their identity. This is
Mm-hmm.
very radical at the time. This is very far from like what it has ended up. What is key to them though is they identify that like this is their how that's a necessary way to organize in that moment to address the kind of uh, gaps that they exist in. But they are, in their mission statement, they say we have to be constantly reflecting on this and kind of like adapting and holding ourselves to like account, and we will be working in coalition with other groups. So it's not
Mm-hmm.
some kind of it's not some rigorously kind of policed boundary where everybody who isn't exactly like them is imagined as an adversary. They're actually
Mm-hmm.
seeking to work in coalitions, the word they use, with other groups of people who have different identities and maybe different struggles, but are all committed to liberation for everybody. And they're also something that you see. So okay, they are grounded in kind of collectivity, as opposed to what you've seen online, which is kind of a expression of identity politics that is completely informed by neoliberalism and individualism. So you're talking about often people are talking about their wider group identity, but in a way that is very like self-serving and very about the individual, because it's not rooted in socialism or communism in the way that
Yeah.
the original idea of it was. And then you also have the Combahee River Collective are not kind of weaponizing their identity so that they're above critique. And that
Mm-hmm.
is something that you see play out on Twitter. So that is very far
Mm-hmm.
from what the original kind of permutations of it were. It's become very distorted and self-serving.
Just regarding the individualism there, do you feel that so Twitter, let's just take Twitter as a space, because quite a lot of important conversations happen on Twitter. Now, the problem I see with Twitter is that Twitter is owned by a giant corporation that make billions. Twitter have decided, here's a space where you can have really, really important conversations, but we, the corporation, set the rules. And the rules are, we will only reward your tweet if it makes people feel angry or frightened. We will reward behavior that's quite combative. We reward performativism. And if you play within these rules, then your tweets will receive quite a lot of likes and visibility. But also, the resources that we extract are data, and data is just a fancy name for your behavior. So do you feel that, like, has Twitter and online spaces, is that what's pushing things towards this individualism that you feel is lacking in the current discourse?
So I would say that I think I actually say it in the book. I can't remember exact quote off the top of my head, but the idea that capitalism has colonized like the most intimate quarters of our life, and our social relations, our personal relationships are actually like through the are filtered through like these kind of individualistic like imperatives and exchanges. So I think that's happening anyway, and then I think that's like turbocharged in a
Yeah.
landscape hellscape like Twitter. I think it's like absolutely like, as you say, things that are like division is gamified and outrage is
Hmm.
rewarded. So often the more reductive and emotionally kind of triggering the content of
Hmm.
what you say is, the more likes and retweets it gathers, the more followers you gain, and the more influential you become,
Yeah.
So it really like actually encourages like shallow politics. I actually think it's a kind of a disaster that
Hmm.
conversations that require, a lot of like understanding and kind of like that are painful conversations rooted in very real historic and ongoing injustices, and yeah, that require kind of like complexity and empathy, are playing out in a space that gamifies division and rewards
Yeah.
outrage. That seems like a disaster.
There's a lovely little quote in the book about coalitions where you say, we seem to have replaced doing anything with saying something. Long gone, it seems, are the organised strikes of the black liberation movements of the 1960s. As Lipsitz notes, there is little evidence of the parallel institutions that were built then: the freedom schools, the community banks, the community land trust, the breakfast clubs. Can you speak about these things? What are those things that were happening in the 60s? Why are they useful? And like, is this what you would like to see now?
Yeah, absolutely. So there were parallel institutions being built because groups like the Black Panthers recognized the real need, like in their communities. Like the breakfast clubs are literally like they're like we're
Like,
not
what,
gonna
what was a
we're
breakfast club? What
so
was a breakfast club?
where Black children, like in the community. I think they started in Oakland because the Panthers start in Oakland.
Hmm.
Um, they go and have breakfast. The Panthers
Hmm.
provide breakfast for these children who, might not otherwise have it. And they know that rather than berating people with, like theory about because they're revolutionary socialists,
Yeah.
but they're like, let's show people socialism in action so that they
Yeah.
understand it. In addition to they to actually join the Black Panthers, you had to go on a 6-week uh, political education um, uh, course, basically, with readings, so that by the time you joined the group, you were grounded in a theoretical kind of basis. But also beyond that, they wanted to show that theory in action. So they're actually they're from the community, and they're like in the community, and they're doing like concrete things, and that's why they're so influential and so powerful and seen as such a
Hmm.
threat to the state. Um, they also have a strong sense that the system that they live under is a corrupt one that is ethically and morally bankrupt. So rather than wanting their seat at the table,
Yeah.
they want to create a new table. They
Yeah.
want to build parallel institutions rather than make the institutions. They didn't want to make the institutions that existed diverse. They didn't want to
Hmm.
like make them inclusive. They wanted new systems that were not to them that were not morally bankrupt as they believed the system to be. So it's very different to today's. What's interesting is the list of. I don't even know what the list of demands today are. There doesn't seem to be like
Yeah.
I can't I don't. I'm not sure what this is for. Like it's to create racial justice, but what does that look like? Is that just inclusion and diversity? And if you think of the language of inclusion and diversity, it's very corporate. A lot of the language of the anti-racism is very corporate. It seems like it was, like focus grouped. And it's actually a relatively conservative set of demands. So what is actually being asked for is not really that much. But there's also an attitude of of kind of not building coalitions. And then you have these groups in the recent past, who are actually demanding a hell of a lot more. Like, they're far more radical. But for some reason, those very radical people seem far more able to work with other groups that today are set up as, or imagined as, adversaries that no one can ever possibly work with, which is kind of a contradiction when we think what the main demands seem to be diversity and inclusion. It just feels like there are inconsistencies in what's happening. It doesn't feel coherent to me. That's why I ground a lot of the book in the movements of the past, because it feels more coherent.
How do you feel about how modern advertising and corporations now kind of co-opt what they see as wokeness as a way to make their brands look good? Because that's a big thing at the moment. Can you speak about that?
Excuse me. Yeah. I was doing this might seem kind of random, but I was actually thinking about I was doing a podcast about Jimi Hendrix, and we were talking about how he had been kind of criticized for not I actually find him very radical in terms of like what he's doing, and like very Afrofuturistic. It's just incredibly inspiring in terms of like what his cultural output is and what he's saying through his creative expression. But he was being, I guess the term we would use now was, he was called out for not more explicitly aligning himself with like the protest that was happening at the time. Even though I feel he's protesting in different ways. But we were talking about how now you'd be encouraged by so he was kind of being called out, not by like the record label or anything, but by just people. But now an artist is almost there's cultural capital in being an activist. You're probably going to be encouraged by your record label to be an activist. It's associated with it's become commodified in many ways. So it's a completely different landscape to the past, where again, I was thinking about Sinead O'Connor the other day. Like, look at the way she was like so vilified for saying things. She just seems like so ahead of her time. Like, she was just vilified and just completely dismissed. Whereas now, an artist that is like, seen as kind of like radical alternative, a punk, it would be expected that they would be challenging these things, or seen to be challenging these things. So it's like protest, or the performance of protest, at least, and the performance of activism has actually become something that is has a lot of cultural capital associated with it, and has potential advantages and rewards for those who are perceived to be involved in certain movements. I don't think I answered your question.
No, you did. One of the chapters is to interrogate whiteness. What does interrogating whiteness look like?
So again, that's not like to interrogate white people. It's to understand. When I talk about whiteness, I'm not talking about like individual white people. I'm talking about the system of whiteness that was created in that exploitative, brutal, colonial history, and was the handmaiden of capitalism, and was a process whereby an extractive and dominant and binary understanding of the world was of reality was imposed throughout the world. So it's looking at whiteness as a system, whiteness as a modus operandi. I also make the point that it's not just people who are racialized as white who see the world through the lens of whiteness. There are people that are racialized in other ways. I mean, whiteness as a system, as a kind of imperial reality, is something that informs the way, we've all internalized,
Yeah.
what I try not to talk about. I try and use language as well that's different to a lot of the kind of more buzzwordy
That's what
rhetoric.
I'm wondering. Yeah, because
So
like
I find myself,
I'm noticing you're not saying words like privilege, and because it's the problem with the buzzwords I find is that they are removing from their original meaning. So are you consciously trying to have this conversation, but then not using words that have now been co-opted by this type of online activism?
yeah, 100%. And I hope that's apparent in the book. I
Yeah.
don't even use the term. I have one bit that's like pull people up on racism, but I was just like, that would normally be, like call people out. Just any
Yes.
phrase that's just become, that might have had utility at one point that has now become kind of untethered from its meaning. I think some of that language actually just causes people to shut down. They
Yeah.
hear
Like
some
the
of these
phrase
words.
woke. Woke
Yeah,
doesn't mean what woke used to mean.
exactly. And I think there are just dyed in the wool, there are committed racists, right? And
Hmm.
I feel there may be kind of a lost cause, and there's probably something that could be done, but I don't really know what that is. I think I'm interested in the vast swathes of people who are actually open to the world being a more just and fair place, but
Hmm.
who the current way of talking about all of this and talking to people, I worry that in this movement, people that might be otherwise persuaded just become alienated,
Hmm.
And I think that's what some of that language really, really runs the risk of doing.
Yeah. We chatted about this before, but like I was raised with media that told me the worst thing I could ever be was a racist. And the thing is, what I found growing up is anti-racism, as it was sold to me in particular by American media, was never sold to me as something about coalition or about fairness or justice or equality. It was portrayed to me as a form of classism, as in it's like American media created what a racist looks like. And what that racist looks like is usually a neo-Nazi or stereotypes about American Southerners. So what was told to me was, if you are racist, it means that you are uh, dumb, inferior, and uncouth and violent. So don't be like that. But that's essentially just classism. No one's saying to me why you shouldn't be racist. They're just saying, don't be the wrong type of white person because we laugh at you in a bourgeois fashion. And this then made me kind of like, if someone would call me a racist, I would immediately get incredibly defensive, as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
actually saying to myself, hold on a second. I may not be the type of person who, as you mentioned, who's a committed racist, who will actually say these horrible, offensive things. I'm not that person, but I do have a hell of a lot of blind spots because I grew up in a society that I benefited from whiteness my entire life, or I benefited from whatever else privilege to say we have. And one thing that's really helped me, and I've always compared it to the journey I've taken on myself with mental health and psychology. Like when I was going through therapy, you have to confront the shadow side of yourself, and you have to take ownership of parts of yourself that you might not like. And only by
Mm-hmm.
accepting those things and not being scared of them and not reacting can you learn and grow. And with racism, I think that's a similar thing. People should be okay to sit back and go, you know what? I think I am a bit racist, or I think I sometimes I do make absolutely bizarre assumptions about entire groups of people based on stereotypes that have been sold to me, and I should probably sit down and go, yeah, I do that actually, as opposed to going,
Yeah.
me, no, racist, no fucking way. Why are you calling me a racist? Is that interrogating whiteness? Is that what that looks like?
So for me, interrogating white, yeah, that could fit under interrogating whiteness. In the book, I have interrogating whiteness more like looking at the history of whiteness and the system of whiteness as it operates. But then I have a section called Stop the Denial, and that
Mm-hmm.
speaks to exactly what you've just described. I'll actually read a tiny bit of it because the synergy between what
Yeah.
you've just said and that is like really apparent. So Stop the Denial. First things first, this is the most basic. It's at once the easiest and perhaps simultaneously the most difficult because I know you've already started denying it. No more. Stop the vehement denial, especially to yourself, that you have racist beliefs. Race was invented to create racist beliefs. It goes with the territory. Of course, racism shows up to varying degrees, but at its most fundamental level, it is the belief that on some level, white people are superior to black and racially minoritized people, and that races have certain predetermined behaviors. And then I'll just skip a bit and go to the end of that part and say, although we have the freedom to create alternatives, as it stands right here and now, we understand ourselves and others through the prism of race. We've been conditioned to see the world through that lens for centuries. Part of that worldview is the internalization of negative and reductive assumptions associated with blackness, and generally positive ones associated with whiteness. So stop the denial. What would make you immune to centuries of socialization? It's a system we've been born into. Over that, you have no control. What you do have control over is what you do next. So,
Fantastic.
yeah, that's
Um,
it.
and also the chapter about abandoning guilt is
Mhm.
what's are you speaking about white guilt there?
Yeah, I am because I draw on Audre Lorde, one of the Combahee River Collective in that part, and she talks about guilt, and she's just like, I have no creative use for guilt. Like guilt is not like
Mm-hmm.
guilt is like a incomplete emotion. If guilt becomes the beginning of if guilt kind of activates action and knowledge, it can kind of transform into something else. But often guilt is like paralyzing and you don't really move. Guilt and denial kind of, and shame all kind of
Yeah,
exist in a similar space. It
yeah.
actually can be paralyzing and stop you doing anything. It can also become quite self-indulgent because you're just, thinking about how you're feeling, and
Mm-hmm.
how not to how not to feel guilty. And I think if the guilt is coming from, I think also responding to racism from a position of guilt kind of really falls into that allyship kind of like white savior trap. I think
Mm-hmm.
you make kind of patronizing and often unhelpful decisions about what your anti-racism or your allyship will look like because the motivation is you trying to make your guilt go away, And then
Mm-hmm.
there's also people that react really, really angrily to the guilt thing. And they're like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, you can't hold me responsible like for what my ancestors did. And
Yeah.
yeah, that's cool. Like, grand, you're not responsible for what your ancestors did, but we have to acknowledge the reality of that history. That's the
Mm-hmm.
interrogate whiteness. You don't have to feel guilty about it, but we have to recognize that history. We have to know what we're talking about. We have to know why we do what we do and where that comes from.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't have responsibility for what your ancestors did. That's cool, but you do have responsibility for what you do. So
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of how I'd frame it.
So is the chapter? Yes, the chapter "Stop Reducing Black People to One Dimension." There's a quote in there that says, "Don't believe in some imagined inherent goodness of all black people as a response to your own self-indulgent guilt at racism." I'm not going to say believe black women or anything trite like that, because funnily enough, not all black women think the same way or indeed agree with each other. So if your mantra is believe black women, you're going to get some mixed messages and come away pretty confused. Can you speak about that? Because again, believe black women is one of these mantras that you see thrown out on social media in these activism spaces that's kind of removed from when I see that now. I don't look at the words. It's like it's I've seen it too much, if you get what I'm
Yeah,
saying.
yeah,
Can you speak
yeah.
about that?
So yeah, that emerges out of like you know like America, I believe, and it's the idea that black women, black people have had have experienced like intergenerational racism in that
Hmm.
country, that continues to diminish their life opportunities and chances, and is like deeply is deeply structural. And when they talk about that experience, being I don't want to use the word gaslit even because it's too
Hmm.
common. But being
Yeah.
gaslit, having their experiences, and the reality of their of that, having it denied, having people, being this attitude, oh, well, civil rights was in the 1960s. Like we had Obama as president, it was a
Hmm.
post-racial society, all of this stuff. So it's like, believe black women speaking about their experiences of racism. But like it's become so removed from that. And I've seen it being used by people who are not like using it in that context. It's just like, believe believe black women talking about all types of things. And then I'm just like, well, this is again inconsistent because I see a lot of tension I see a lot of disagreement amongst black people in the same way I see a lot of disagreement amongst white people. Like one of the basic tenets of
Hmm.
racism is that all black people think the same way,
Hmm.
So how are we going to believe, like, what if I think one thing, but another black woman thinks a completely different thing? Like, but if we believe black women, which which one do we believe? So like
It's a bit
people still,
dehumanizing.
it's dehumanizing. Exactly, that's the point that I make. And it's also it's that thing of reducing black people to one dimension, and not understanding that they have. I might just actually read
Go
a
on.
little bit of that. Stop believing that black people are inherently bad, are inherently good, are inherently anything. I can't believe I'm writing this because it feels so painfully obvious. Yet the allyship framework can be so infantilizing and patronizing that it is sadly necessary. But here's the thing, like you, black people are people with the full range of complexity, contradiction, and emotion that comes with humanity. Until white people are prepared to see us as innocent, or indeed as less than saintly, depending on what variety of white perspective we are dealing with, racism is present. While there is a strong narrative of black inherent dishonesty amongst racists, at times I've seen almost an inverse of that in some anti racist allies. You know?
Hmm.
So, yeah, don't do that. Like, still use your critical faculties
Yeah.
and apply that to the information you're being presented with. Don't just like inherently like believe that everything you're told is written in stone, like
Hmm.
you use your critical faculties.
And just as a final question, Emma, who should be buying this book? And also, as well, I was asked a question on Instagram: is the book for people who are not black but are other people of color?
Oh yeah, like totally. I actually, one of the things I talk about is how, again, the Black Panthers, as revolutionary socialists, were internationalists. So they saw
Hmm.
their struggle as in sympathy and movement with the struggles of oppressed people all over the world. So with the Vietnamese, it's they're internationalist in their approach.
Hmm.
I talk as well about like the Black British activism of the 1970s, where again they are
Hmm.
anti-imperialists, and Marxists often. So they see parallels in their struggle with with Bangladeshis, with the Irish.
Hmm.
Like there's an internationalism. So those earlier movements are less, even though there's names like the Black Panthers, it's actually less
Hmm.
grounded in like an identity politics. It's more grounded in like there's a theoretical framework, which is revolutionary socialism. So that allows you to like plug into lots of other struggles. But with this, with these boundaries of like kind of increasingly policed boundaries of like identity, it seems to shut down internationalism. It seems to shut down solidarity. It seems to shut down the ability to recognize sameness in the struggles of other people. So yes, absolutely, this book is for other people. It's really for anybody that wants to be free and that wants to like imagine a world that is, you know, far more kind of, it's for anybody that wants things to be different but feels that our current kind of ideas or path to getting there is inadequate and maybe even, you know, counterproductive.
And in the final chapter, you told me you argue for like almost an ecological view of the future, the post-activism chapter. Can you speak about that?
Yeah. So I write that you know, we have to see our struggles as interlinked, and that like we are all, irrespective of our identities, affected by the ecological crisis, and that opens up, you know, actually I don't want to try and put like a positive spin on environmental disaster, but it does open up potentially, you know, exciting possibilities for new affinities, for
Mm-hmm.
new for unexpected affinities to develop, because we all
Mm-hmm.
need to be invested in this. And one of the things, you know, that whiteness as a system did that was really central, as an exploitative and dominant system uh, of capitalism, that is what is that's what's responsible for the ecological crisis. You know, this
Yes.
idea of infinite growth
Yes.
that capitalism is requires and demands is destroying the earth. So the imposition of that system bulldozed over relationships, that pre-colonial relationships that, you know, indigenous people, African people, Asian people, and also Irish people,
Yeah.
colonized people had with their environment. You know,
Yes.
these entanglements between ourselves and nature, our relationship with the natural world, that's all bulldozed
Mm.
over by this
Yes.
colonial, imperial, extractive system. So it's about like acknowledging that. I make reference to a number of like kind of pre-colonial concepts that are more kind of that have a different understanding of human relationality to the environment, not seeing ourselves as, you know, dominant and separate to
Mm-hmm.
the environment, but part of it and entangled with it, and how that kind of shift in attitude is kind of the solution to the environmental to not abusing the environment, because essentially we're abusing
Mm-hmm.
ourselves, you know. So I end with looking at that and thinking about how coalition could be built between, like, you know, racial justice, environmental justice, and different movements.
Emma, thank you so much for that chat. That was really enlightening and it was very enjoyable. And if ye want to buy Emma's book, the Court Festival has a dedicated seller called Charlie Burns. And if you want to check out more stuff that's happening at the festival, go to court.ie. And if you'd like to make a donation to the festival, you can go to court.ie/support us. Thank you very much to Emma and for Court for having me on here. It was good crack.